Remember last time I said we'll see what happens until next Wednesday? Well, a lot of things happened. Okay. First off,
China, an oasis of calm
yeah,
in the midst
exactly.
of all of this. I mean, it really is. I mean,
Yes.
it's the place, it's the one place which is stable, still stable. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. Yeah. And China has been trying pretty hard to keep it that way. So I think
Yeah.
there has not been any really calm. There has been provocations. So that hasn't
Mm.
stopped, I think, but China
Yeah.
has been handling it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay, let's start with talking about China. How do you feel about the pick, Tim Walz, Harris' running mate? What I feel like they are trying to counter JD Vance because he's come from the Midwest and kind of come from countryside, that kind of thing. Just so you know, China actually paid attention to him because he has some China Connect. And
Ah,
yeah, so just to share with you, you might find that interesting.
I
So
didn't know this.
yeah, as early as 1989, he actually spent a year in China teaching high school, I think, teaching English.
Mm.
And then later, when he got married in 1994, he spent his honeymoon in China.
Mm.
And then I think his wife and him also involved. They have been running a company that they organize high schoolers go visit China in the summer. So they have
Mm.
done that for decades, for a long time.
Mm.
So he has visited China many times. Now he never claimed he speaks Chinese, but from time to time when he became governor, he did say Happy New Year to in Cantonese to the
Mm.
Chinese community, I guess,
Mm.
etc. But also when he was in the House, he was in the committee, in the House committee related to China, and he did co-sponsor some bills to criticize China of human rights, violations, and
Mm.
urge China, put pressure on China to release dissidents, etc. You know, those kind of same
Mm.
same script that we are very familiar with. But he was the co-sponsor. I paid attention to that. He wasn't taking initiative himself, it seems to me. So it could
Yeah.
be he's under the pressure. Could be that just that's the way the consensus are in Washington, whatever.
Mm.
So with that, I think that's the reason people in China did pay attention, and that's when I read it, in the Chinese media. With
Well,
all
that's
that,
yeah.
with all that, do you think he could be a China moderate, or am I too optimistic?
No, no, you're not being optimistic. I mean, it does seem as if he generally likes the country and has a real connection to it. The fact that he chose to go there with his wife after they married, the fact that he spent a whole year there, the fact that he's maintained all of these contacts for such a long time, suggests that we're looking at somebody who, at some level, actually likes China quite a lot. And I wouldn't put too much into the fact that he's co-sponsored these bills. The fact is that the very fact that he's got these connections with China is going to make him a very suspicious person for some people. They're going to say, well, is this really somebody we can trust and is reliable? And so, for that reason, in order to buy himself insurance and to get himself some cover from the kind of attacks that one can expect, he goes ahead and co-sponsors these sort of bills. I'm afraid that's the sort of price you have to pay to be a political figure in Washington nowadays. So yes, I would actually treat this as a good sign, and it might reinforce some glimmers of feeling that there exists that a possible Kamala Harris administration might be prepared to take steps to shift American foreign policy in some way. I mean, the other reason why Tim Walz has been picked, rather than the person that everybody thought would be picked, which was beginning to harden that it was going to be Josh Shapiro. Shapiro, after all, is the governor of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is an important state in the election. The Democrats need to win it. And he was the person who many expected would be able to deliver Pennsylvania to Harris. Well, I think the reason they picked Waltz over Shapiro again comes down to foreign policy, which is that Shapiro is seen as being too close to Israel. And at a time when there's real problems within the Democratic Party about the relationship, the very close ties that the US government, the Biden administration has had to Israel. Um, that's, I think, the primary reason why they decided to, skip
Mhm.
Shapiro and go for Walz. So, but they will have known when they made the pick that Walz has this connection to China. And, it may be that they are finally looking to try and moderate their foreign policies in some way, and that is what they're going to do. But of course, the problem with the United States is that political leaders emerge there, they gain high office, one attaches hopes to them, one is optimistic about what they will do, and then it all ends in crushing disappointment because the forces that seek confrontation ultimately invariably turn out to be too strong and invariably come out and win. And that we've seen that play out time and again. I remember with Obama, I remember with, when Trump came in, he said he'd improve relations with Russia. I mean, so, one shouldn't, it's a slender twig to place any reliance on an American politician, especially when he's not going to be the president. He's only going to be the vice president. So one wouldn't put too much hope in this.
Yeah, because in the same time, people are discussing about this. They were talking about the former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China, Terry Branstad, from Iowa, right? And he also is being regarded as a moderate. He was also, I think, he was trying to improve the relationship, in particular trade, stuff like that. In the end, but that was under Trump, and we all know
Mm.
Trump probably himself trying to get along, but in the end, he was pretty much
Mm.
controlled by the Pompeo,
Yeah.
but sidelined by Pompeo. And so Terry Branstad basically resigned because he just couldn't continue this very weird kind of, on the one hand, he's trying to do
Mm.
something, but always sidelined by Pompeo. And of course, it got really bad after they kidnapped Meng Wanzhou. All that kind of thing became impossible for
Yeah.
him to continue his own way of doing things. So that's in the end he resigned. That's how people interpreted in China why he left, because he didn't have trouble with the Chinese leader in China. China liked him. So
Yeah.
but that's pretty much, yeah, what you're saying. Yes.
Well, this is exactly so. I mean, the same, happens with the current director of the CIA, Bill Burns. He was
Uh-huh.
apparently he was U.S. ambassador to Moscow. The Russians liked him very much. They thought he was a person they could talk to. He seemed interested in what they were saying to him. He was a successful and effective diplomat, by all
Mhm.
accounts. We know from WikiLeaks that he was sending good and wise and correct
Yeah.
warnings to Washington about American foreign policy. But in the end, it all amounted to nothing. So, it's exactly the same. One can't, unfortunately, place reliance on people, individuals.
Individuals.
There
Yeah.
has to be a fundamental shift in the mood in the United States, and it might be the fact that people like Waltz are emerging. Even the fact that Vance is emerging might be
Mhm.
straws in the wind, but one shouldn't place any reliance on them at the moment. And for what it's worth, I have to say that my impression anyway is that the neocon tendency is even stronger in the Democratic Party at the moment than it is in the Republican one, which is saying something.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think one person probably won't make much of a difference,
Mm,
however important that person, the position really is. But yeah, you're right. The neocons always get their way, and they don't have
mm,
reverse gear. They
mm,
just keep on making things worse when things doesn't go
mm,
their way. So that's how it
mm.
has been, yeah, play out all the time. Yes. What's going on in Britain? Can you give me, is
What is
multiple
going on?
places? Yeah, go ahead.
well, let me say first of all that I just there's a lot of things to explain here. Firstly, I think there's a point which many people outside Britain are not aware of, which is that in Britain, rioting in August is actually a fairly regular thing. I mean, I'm not saying it happens every year, but it happens quite often in August that you get riots and disturbances and all kinds of things happen. So, in a sense that we're getting riots now, it isn't that surprising. I think a lot of people have this idea that Britain is a very orderly and law-abiding and peaceful country. It is in some ways, but not in others. And there's a long-standing history of rioting in Britain, and unrest and protests in cities. So I think there's that to say. The second is that despite the impressions that you might be getting from the media, including the British media, the rioting this year has not been particularly extensive. I've been doing checks with various people I know. I've checked the local media up and down the country. The vast most of Britain is quiet. I mean, there are protests in some places, but they're not that widespread. The third thing to say is that what was the trigger of the protests was a very, very ugly and horrible murder carried out in a town called Southport, in which three young people were, were, were stabbed to death. Now, again, and I've worked in the justice system myself. I can tell you that this isn't uncommon either. It's very common in Britain when there's a violent murder which captures the public imagination, especially one which involves children, in which children are killed, that you suddenly see an outburst of anger and violence, and people come out onto the streets and start doing things of that kind. So all of this is, none of this is that different from the standard. But there are differences this time. The first and the most important difference by far is that the British government, Keir Starmer's government, instead of trying to calm the situation, is inflaming it. They're making out that these protests are taking place on a much bigger scale than they are. Now, that's bizarre if you think about it. It's not usual for governments to come around and give the whole world the impression that Britain is going up in flames when it isn't. I mean, that's not what governments generally do, but it is what this particular government is doing. And it is also, and not without some cause, by the way, playing up the role of what they call the far right in these protests, by which they mean fascist, racist people who undoubtedly exist in Britain in significant numbers, especially in England, and who are to some extent part of these protests. And that there's no doubt at all that some of these protests are being directed against immigrant groups and things of that kind. But what the government is doing is, again, it's giving the impression that this racist element in British society is very large and very powerful and very dangerous. Well, to be frank, I don't think it is. And I don't think the actual scale of the protests is such as would make you think that it is, even if one assumed that all of these protesters and rioters were indeed far right and racist and right wing and all of that kind of thing, which, by the way, I'm not convinced they are. I mean, a lot of them are just young people, boys, who are not going to school because it's the August holidays, and do what a lot of English boys do, which is drink a lot on the hot days and go out and riot. I mean, this is unfortunately very common if you've lived in England. So, I mean, a lot of that is what is going on here. And I think the government is doing this because they have an agenda, which is that they want to create this impression within British society that the country is deeply divided, that there's a large ultra right, far right fascist forces building up their strength across Britain, that they're a major danger, and that somehow justifies the various other repressive moves that the government wants to take, tightening up on social media, increasing censorship, increasing surveillance, limiting the rights of protest, doing a lot of that kind of thing. And I think this rhetoric is partly intended both to mobilize people on the centre and the left in Britain who are very disappointed with this government that we have at the moment, which is promising more of the same, basically. So I think they want to mobilize them and to unite them behind the government. Oh, that's one part of the strategy. And the other is that they want to advance this much more restrictive agenda than the one we've seen up to now. And I think that's probably coming as well. So I don't want to give the impression that there are no protests and there is no rioting going on. That wouldn't be true.
Mhm.
And I certainly don't want to give the impression that there aren't any far right, extreme, racist, unpleasant, horrible, wicked people in Britain, because there absolutely are. But I do think that this affair is being manipulated in ways that I find rather concerning.
Just so the other thing that when people are reading what's going on in Britain, they
Mm.
always like to use this phrase, "a beautiful sight to behold." Now, this is Nancy Pelosi's description when Hong Kong riot happened. So ever
Mm.
since that, this has been used whenever there's a January 6th or any protest in the
Yeah,
Western countries. People will say, oh, "Okay, another beautiful sight to behold." Still, just so you know. I think the US has done similar things. They
yeah,
make it like a January 6th. They make it such a big deal. I mean,
yeah,
January 6th by and large has been peaceful. I mean, the
yeah,
person being killed is a protest, right? But they make it such a big deal. They prosecuted everybody, etc.
yeah,
I think they pretty much what you're saying, they have an agenda, I believe. And the same thing with the campus protest or the students protest, I think
yeah,
also very peaceful.
yeah,
If you look at Columbia University, the students, they did exactly what the rule says. They find a place that allowed them to do so.
yeah,
And then they protest there. But then the school is still very brought in the police, etc. They make it and they call it anti-Semitic, which is
yeah,
not true. The people there are protesting the Israeli government for genocide. They are not really focusing, targeting particular ethnicities, but they are being portrayed as such. So I think that they are pretty much doing the same thing as you were saying. I do think that the government has an agenda when actually in reality it's not as bad as it is, but they make it bigger deal so that they can justify their authoritarian method. Is that overall that's
yeah,
what
yeah,
you?
you're absolutely right, and the parallels with the United States are very striking. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think they play out. It plays out exactly in the way that you said. And notice, of course, and it's a good point that you mentioned the Colombia protests, because this is protest both on the left and on the right that is
Hmm.
being suppressed. The
Yeah.
same, by the way, is true in Britain. There's also been a big attempt to talk up supposed lawless behavior
Hmm.
by people who are protesting what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. And those protests have been completely peaceful in
Yeah.
Britain. My wife has attended a few, by the way, just saying. So, and nonetheless, if you were to judge from what the authorities have been saying about them and certain newspapers have been saying about them, you would imagine that, again, it was all, extreme left, Islamic, all kind of radicals, ISIS type people running the mob in London, and by the way, just on the point of the violence, no one has died in these protests.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's no there's not been a single person. There's not been a single fatality. There's
Hmm.
been a certain amount of property damage. A mosque in Southport was set on fire. Terrible,
Hmm.
shocking, outrageous things. But um, again, to repeat a point I made before, if you know some of these cities where these things happen, the big industrial cities, this isn't that rare. I mean, summer is, as I said, a time when riots happen quite regularly in England.
Mhm.
We may appear to be an orderly and law-abiding people, but especially young people, quite often are not.
Yeah. It's interesting because in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, that there were a lot of clashes and you can say violence and
Mm,
people like Malcolm X, right? That he made it
yeah,
very clear, that peaceful protest is not going to work. So you have to be, using violence and sometimes and justified. And of course, he got killed.
mm,
And then the government, I think the US government got scared. So they pushed forward this peaceful message. So they think Martin Luther King is the good guy because he's peaceful, right? So they feel like they could handle as long as you're peaceful. But now it seems like they're even afraid of the peaceful protest now. They
well,
feel like
indeed.
they cannot control that even. It seems to
Well,
me.
that's exactly right. I mean, they don't. I mean, the thing, the ultimate explanation for the not for the riots themselves, but for the government's reaction to them, is that the government and the political class in Britain are very insecure. We've
Uh-huh.
discussed
Hmm.
this in previous programs.
Yeah.
We saw that with the election, where turnout was incredibly low by British standards. We've seen this in the way in which the government achieved a lopsided election result with an enormous majority based on the votes of just a fifth of the British voters. And the Conservative Party at the same time has collapsed. The Liberal Party is popular. There's never been a time when the British elite has felt less secure.
Hmm.
Never. Not
Hmm.
at any point in its modern history, going all the way back to the 17th century. So this nervousness is expressing itself in the way in which they respond to events, which, you know, once upon a time, not that long ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, well, they would have achieved a certain degree of coverage, obviously in Britain, because riots always do, but not the kind of incredible coverage that they do today.
Hmm.
And with, the enormously fraught language that is used about these protests, which is absolutely not the case previously.
Yeah.